Warning: the information or views displayed on this podcast may not be the same as any one individual listener's views. If you strongly disagree, you have the freedom to simply turn it off or get your own podcast to voice your own views or information if this podcast does not fulfill your idea of what should be talked about. You're listening to Fringianity. Hello and welcome to Fringianity. On this episode, I'm going to get into some stuff about Zionism and how prideful and arrogant it can be. It's a political movement. It's not a religious movement or a race or any of that stuff. And many people mix it up with it being Jewish in nature totally. It's all, but you can be a Jew and not be a Zionist. And I've covered all that before on other podcasts. But on this one, I wanted to get more into the history of how Israel came to be, the Israel we know today. And also, I'm going to get into some other stuff that's not talked about very much in history that happened during World War II, or before World War II really took off, when the Zionists made a deal with the Nazis. But that's all coming up later. First, let's get into Scripture. Galatians 3:6-7. Even as Abraham believed God, and it was accounted to him for righteousness. Know ye therefore that they which are of the faith, the same are the children of Abraham. And that means Christians who are of the faith in Jesus are of the children of Abraham. So we deserve the inheritance of the kingdom as well. So it's not just the Jews. Anyone who doesn't believe in Jesus is not, and it does not have the inheritance of the king, right? So if the Jews deny Jesus, then that means they don't deserve the inheritance of Jesus, right? So that's something to be said. And I don't hate the Jews. I would like them to get saved. All of them. I don't wish any ill on any Jew whatsoever. Because I don't want them to die at all. Because I want them to get saved and come to know Jesus Christ. That's the whole entire point of why I even discuss this and try to break it down. Many people are brainwashed into thinking that anytime you discuss anything or be critical of Israel in any way, then you are suddenly anti-Semitic and you hate them. That was a brainwashing, and I'll get into that in a little bit here. But first, here's a brief intro into how Israel came to be in Palestine.
What is Zionism? Zionism is a political and national movement aimed at creating and sustaining a Jewish state in the Middle East. Now, according to many traditional and Orthodox Jewish teachings, Jews are forbidden by God to have their own state until their Messiah comes. But this hasn't stopped Zionism from pushing towards that very goal. So where did this all start? Let's go back to 1897. A man named Theodor Herzl formed the World Zionist Organization. He advocated for the creation of a Jewish state in Palestine, and is even mentioned in the Israeli Declaration of Independence. It was tough to be a Jew in Europe at that time, with anti-Semitic sentiments rising. Herzl felt the only way for his people to live in peace was for them to have their own country. Palestine was chosen, and a popular slogan started spreading around the world. A land without a people, for a people without a land. The only problem was, Palestine wasn't a land without a people. A large number of Muslims and Christians, along with a smaller number of Jews, had been living there together in peace for centuries. But for many Christian Zionists living in the West and Jewish Zionists living in Europe, that made little difference. Following the fall of the Ottoman Empire at the end of World War I, and along with British support, Jewish immigration to the newly British-occupied Palestine was steady in the early 20th century. Then there was a turning point, World War II. Following the Holocaust, the flow of Jews to occupied Palestine boomed, and many Western countries began backing the idea of a Jewish state in Palestine. Although a UN resolution recommended both an independent Arab and Jewish state in the region, Israel went ahead and declared their independence in 1948 and was recognized by US President Harry Truman that very same day. The Zionist movement had achieved its main victory. In the period after its establishment, Israel carried out an invasion of neighboring countries, and at the end of 1967's Six-Day War, Israel extended its control in the region, displacing countless Christian and Muslim Palestinians. A year later, the 28th World Zionist Congress adopted the Jerusalem Program, a list of 5 goals, which are the current makeup of modern Zionism: the unity of the Jewish people and the centrality of Israel in Jewish life, the ingathering of the Jewish people in its historic homeland, the strengthening of the State of Israel, which is based on the prophetic vision of justice and peace, the preservation of the identity of the Jewish people through the fostering of Jewish and Hebrew education, and the protection of Jewish rights everywhere. In practice, their goals of justice and peace have been lost to many of the non-Jewish people living in the region. The Israeli military has been illegally controlling and occupying much of Palestine, and constant new illegal settlement building on Palestinian land by the Zionist state has been condemned by much of the international community. So what do you think about Zionism?
Here are some quotes from leaders and popular Zionists from back in the day. And some of these things will shock you, but I'm not making it up. This is their statements, not mine. Okay, so here's Theodor Herzl, who they just talked about. Here's his quote. This is his quote and not mine. "It is essential that the suffering of Jews become worse. This will assist in realization of our plans. I have an excellent idea. I shall induce anti-Semites to liquidate Jewish wealth. The anti-Semites will assist us hereby in that they will strengthen the persecution and oppression of Jews. The anti-Semites shall be our best friends." And this was written in his diaries in 1897. Okay, here's another one. Now these are quotes. These are not my words. This is Maurice Samuel, taken from his book, You Gentiles, page 155. Okay, he writes, "We Jews, we are the destroyers, and we will remain the destroyers. Nothing you can do will meet our demands and needs. We will forever destroy because we want a world of our own." And that's a quote from him. Here's a quote from Menachem Begin, 1977 through 1983, 6th Prime Minister of Israel. This is the Prime Minister of Israel. "Our race is the master race. We are the divine gods on this planet. We are as different from the inferior races as they are from insects." That doesn't sound Nazi, does it? Here's a quote from Ariel Sharon, the Prime Minister, on October 3, 2001. IAP News. "Every time we do something, you tell me Americans will do this and will do that. I want to tell you something very clear. Don't worry about American pressure on Israel. We, the Jewish people, control America, and the Americans know it." That doesn't sound arrogant or anything, does it? Here's a quote from Shlomet Alani former Israel cabinet member, winner of the 2000 Israel Prize. This is a quote from her. Anti-Semitic, it's a trick. We always use it to stifle legitimate criticism of Jews and Zionist Israel. So obviously they're using the anti-Semitic thing against people who speak against Israel. You can't criticize Israel because you're anti-Semitic. Well, according to this woman, she's using that to shut you up, to silence your free speech. Okay, so here's another little, like a 10-minute clip here. I agree with pretty much everything this girl says, so I feel I'll cut back on my own talk on this show because this is so agreeable to me.
Hey internet friends! It's been a while since I've uploaded an accelerated history/explanation video, and I figured it was about time to make one on Zionism. For many of you, this will not be new information, but not all of us are there yet. And this video is for those navigating the labyrinth of information out there. So let's get started. By definition, Zionism is a movement for, originally, the re-establishment and now the development and protection of a Jewish nation, in what is now known as Israel. The movement originated in the eastern and central parts of Europe and became a political organization in 1897. The Zion part of Zionism refers to a hill in Jerusalem. But before we move on, let's make something really clear here. Zionism is not Judaism. Judaism is a religion, whereas Zionism is a political ideology for one type of people. You can be ethnically Jewish and not practice Judaism. You don't have to be Jewish in order to be a Zionist. Even Joe Biden says so.
Early on when I was a kid, I'd say, when I was a young senator, I'd say, if I were a Jew, I'd be a Zionist. I am a Zionist. You don't have to be a Jew to be a Zionist.
Now, as many of you know, I'm from the South, specifically the Bible Belt of the United States, where Christian Zionism is commonplace, or the Christian belief that God's chosen people have a divine right to the Jewish state, also known as the Promised Land. And if you don't agree, then bless your heart, you're literally Hitler. Of course, this belief stems from the Bible, the belief that the Jews returning their homeland is fulfilling biblical prophecy. In the book of Genesis, God called Abraham out of his homeland and made a promise. To your descendants I will give this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the Euphrates. This verse serves as one of the supporting arguments for Christian Zionism. Bearing that in mind, regular old Zionism allegedly got its start in response to the resurgence of anti-Semitism. What's funny is that among the considerations for a Jewish state were Argentina, Uganda, Cyprus, and even Texas. Throughout the early 1900s, numerous Zionist groups began to pop up across the United States, with various publications serving as a vehicle for Zionist propaganda. The goal was to influence both the United States Congress and the general public, though the sentiment amongst U.S. officials at the time was that Zionism countered both U.S. interests and principles, since it involved matters related to countries other than the United States. But then the world erupted into war. During World War I, which resulted in the fall of the Ottoman Empire, a secret agreement took place called the Sykes-Picot Treaty. And this treaty was whipped up in 1916. It drew out the new borders of the Middle East, dividing the region into states, and under that treaty, Palestine was placed under international control. Post-World War I, the British assumed control over Palestine, and only 1 year after the Sykes-Picot Treaty was signed came the Balfour Declaration. Nestled in a letter between the United Kingdom's Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour and addressed to Walter Rothschild, the declaration promised Palestine as a home for the Jewish people. Keep in mind, this was the Rothschild banking family who were among those actively funding both sides of the First World War. And the same practice was applied to World War II because countries who were at war needed money in order to arm their soldiers and keep them fed, among other things. But monetary profit was just icing on the cake for Rothschild Zionism. In order to fully execute their Zionist state, a hub that would serve as a means of control over the Middle East, they needed Jewish people to have motivation to reside there, and global superpowers to support it. Leading up to this time, Zionists were actively buying up land in Palestine and settling there, where Palestinian Jews, Christians, and Muslims already resided. And yes, it's true, Palestinians did attempt revolt before the State of Israel was officially established in 1948, which Zionists cited as being motivated by anti-Semitism. But if you take a step back and objectively look at what was taking place, Palestine was their home, and it was obvious to the Arabs that it was being invaded, taken from them. So now that we've covered the history of Zionism up to the creation of the State of Israel in 1948, let's talk about the results of a Jewish ethno-state. Following the creation of the State of Israel, 700,000 Palestinian civilians were expelled and fled from their homes, in what some might refer to as an ethnic cleansing of sorts, which seems pretty anti-Semitic to me, since by definition a Semite is anyone who speaks a Semitic language. Since 1948, Israel has implemented a regime of settler colonialism, apartheid, and occupation over the Palestinian people, with war being a daily reality. In 1967, the Six-Day War between neighboring Arab states and Israel took place, with Israel coming out ahead, capturing and occupying the Gaza Strip in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and, of course, the Syrian Golan Heights. Despite the UN calling for Israel's withdrawal, they've held on to these lands, which has really caused some problems, not just for Israel and the neighboring regions, but for everyone. The Zionist defense of their treatment of Palestinians is that Israel was isolated and abandoned by everybody after World War II. They had to fend for themselves and were surrounded by hostile states. They claimed that their actions were out of self-defense. After all, Jewish Zionists see themselves as God's chosen people. And this territory, in their view, was given to them by God, and it was their destiny to take it. A part of this Zionist manifest destiny was perpetual war in the Middle East. It's very reminiscent of how American colonists violently stole more and more land from Native Americans over time, resulting in Native American genocide. But Israel's expansion into the Greater Israel through wars of conquest, as well as their human rights violations, go unpunished by the United Nations. Though in 1975, the United Nations General Assembly Resolution 3379 determined that Zionism was a form of racism and racial discrimination. However, this determination was revoked in 1991. But still, it seems like while Israel is a Jewish state, it's only for a certain type of Jewish people. And the Palestinian Jews that were there already, or the Ethiopian Jews, for example, that were transported there throughout the 80s and the 90s, well, they seem less than desired there. And what's ironic about all of this is that there is debate about the origin of these European Jews who started the Zionist movement, as a number of them have ancestry that has been traced back to, well, not the original 12 tribes of Israel, but back to the Khazarian Empire where they converted to Judaism, taking on the Jewish identity. And there is speculation that these are the fake Jews the Book of Revelation warned about. To summarize, Israel has and continues to commit human rights violations against Palestinian civilians, as documented by the UN and human rights organizations. These are repeated examples, daily tragedies that the global superpowers have turned a blind eye to. Presumably in the United States, it's because the Zionist lobby has a great deal of power, and any criticism of Israel and its practices is silenced by accusations of anti-Semitism. The violence continues because Israel receives support from the governments around the world, as well as corporations. For example, in 2016, the United States finalized a deal with Israel for $38 billion in military aid to be distributed there over the next 10 years. And even before that, Israel was the largest recipient of American aid. Since the creation of Israel, American soldiers have fought and died in wars that were a result of the Zionist agenda. And as of December 6, 2017, the United States has recognized Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, a move that is undoubtedly going to worsen tensions between Israel and its neighbors. So what will that mean for American soldiers? The whole Jerusalem move, it's just an odd move altogether, given that Israel seems to operate straight out of Washington, D.C., not Jerusalem. So why wouldn't they just make Washington, D.C. their capital? But to put it all in perspective, the reality of Zionism is that European Jews who were allegedly oppressed and fled their homeland as a result of being marginalized now oppress another group of people, forcing them to flee their homeland. But question it and you're labeled anti-Semitic. But that's alright, I've been called anti-Semitic before. I'm sure somebody's rattling away on their keyboards in a rage calling me anti-Semitic right now. So my question is, if European Jews suffered so greatly during the Holocaust, which I was repeatedly taught in school and told not to question, why is it that they practice ethnic cleansing in their own Jewish state? And why do Christian Zionists support this ethnic cleansing with their silence? Yes, wars of conquest, colonization, and oppression of certain peoples, it's a tale as old as time. But you and me were living in the now, during an information war. During an era of deception, with global leaders who claim to be civil and humane but operate under illusion, using religion as a form of disguise. But everything I've just covered in this video, this is Zionism with its mask off. This is a promised land flooded by blood and tears. This is a culture of endless war. This is death.
And I agree with that. Why are all the Christians in support of the tragedies in, even the Christians losing their rights and stuff in Palestine? Why is Christians in America supporting all this? Here's another little segment that goes deeper down the rabbit hole on the history of Zionism and the agreements that they have made with the Nazis.
This is Ken Livingstone, a major political figure in Britain for decades. He was mayor of London for 8 years, until 2008. He was recently suspended from the Labour Party for a supposedly anti-Semitic comment he made when talking about the 1930s. It's all bogus. We talk about the issue with historian Lenni Brenner, from whom Livingstone says he learned about what the Zionists were up to in those years.
I'll be speaking to historian Lenni Brenner. He's written 3 books and edited 2 more. He's best known for the book Zionism in the Age of the Dictators. He's actually in the middle of the dispute because one of the people involved is saying that he based his opinion on that very book by Lenni Brenner. Good afternoon.
Hi. Okay, what do you want to know?
All right, first let's establish your credentials. You specialize in this area of German and Jewish history.
Right. My first book, Zionism in the Age of the Dictators, was published in Britain by a prominent publishing house and got a rave review from Edward Mortimer in the London Times, praising it for its documentation and so on. And Mortimer later became the communications director of the United Nations. So as an author, I now understand when you get a review from such a prominent person in such a prominent newspaper, your book has been a success.
And then you followed it up with 2 other books.
All right. I then followed it up with The Iron Wall, which is a study of what's called the Zionist revisionist movement, which is the movement today of Bibi Netanyahu, the prime minister. Netanyahu's father was the secretary of Vladimir Jabotinsky, the founder of the Zionist revisionist movement.
And then 51 documents?
All right. And then, after a while I realized, hey, in my books, in those 2 books, I quoted documents, but I could back them up by publishing a book with many of the complete texts of the documents. So it's called 51 Documents, Zionist Collaboration with the Nazis.
Let's jump right into this. Ken Livingstone, who was mayor of London from 2000 to 2008, made some remarks this week about Hitler and Zionism in the 1930s. As a result, he was suspended from his Labour Party. Shortly after his suspension, he was quoted in the British paper The Guardian as saying that he got his information about all this principally from Lenni Brenner's book about Zionism. So the sentences that have driven some to fury occur in this interview where Livingstone was talking about Hitler. He said that when Hitler was first elected in 1932, quote, his policy was that Jews should be moved to Israel. He was supporting Zionism, went mad, and ended up killing 6 million Jews, unquote. So that was his statement, and this is what some has deemed as anti-Semitic, and that started the whole row. So before we talk about Livingstone, let's talk about the period. What was going on with Zionism and Hitler and all that?
Bear with me. Actually, let me start with what Livingstone said and use that as the basis. He said when in 1932, Hitler backed Zionism in Israel, and then he went mad, and after that he went mad and decided to kill 6 million Jews. Now, he was talking in the middle of a discussion. He wasn't sitting there quoting from my books or any books at the time. So he made a couple of errors, very minor errors, some of them. Hitler, there was an election in Germany in 1932, but Hitler actually came to power as Hitler, the Führer, in 1933, like January 1933, all right? And he used the term Israel, and of course at that time, in 1933, it was still called Palestine, and the Zionists were part of British mandatory Palestine. Now, he said, Hitler went mad, and then after supporting Zionism in 1933, Hitler went mad and decided to kill 6 million Jews. Now, actually, in Mein Kampf, which was written in 1926, or published in 1926, he talks about how the Germans should have killed 12 or 15,000 Jews during World War I because they were opposed to Germany in the war,
So, so there's no doubt that he was a vile beast with these horrendous opinions in the 20s, not in the 30s.
Right. But he comes to power in 1933. Understand, Germany at that time had an army that amounted to a Boy Scout unit, because after the Versailles Treaty, Germany was reduced to a minuscule army. So whatever he wanted to do to the Jews in Germany, he was limited by, number one, if he got too outrageous, he might be invaded by Britain and France, and number two, more important than that, the Jews were major merchants all over Europe and America, and if they were boycotting German goods, and if Hitler didn't sell German goods, the local capitalists there would say, Adolf, it's time for you to leave.
Let's emphasize that for some people don't know the term boycott. So right after he takes over in Germany, he gets appointed chancellor. Jewish war veterans in the U.S. and all sorts of other people start saying, don't buy German goods.
Right, and not only Jews, but leftists all over the world, in other words, Hitler outlawed the Social Democratic Party and the Communist Party in Germany, and they had supporters all over the world and so on. So, you have to put yourself in Hitler's mind at the time. Whatever he would like to do is one thing, but at the time, he had his main top priority was pushing the Jews out of Germany, and at the same time selling German goods. So all of a sudden, the Zionists, the World Zionist Organization, sends him some representatives and saying, look, to Berlin, and saying, look, you guys want the Jews out of Germany, we want them in Palestine. Okay, now let's do a deal. And the way it worked was this. Anybody, Jewish or German, who was sending their money out of Germany got nicked at the gate by what you might call an exit tax. Okay? So the Zionists and the Nazis worked out a deal. Now I'm using round numbers now just to, so people can get the point. A Jew wanted to send $5,000 worth of money out of Germany. So normally, let's say the Nazis would nick $500 off that, out of the 5,000, for their tax. With the Zionists, with money going to Palestine, it would only be $250. Okay, so and nobody else got that special discount.
And it wasn't in money, right? They had to actually, sell German products.
Yes. Okay, now, the way it worked, since the Nazis were very concerned about the boycott of German goods, what they would do is this. The Jew in Germany would give the Nazis $5,000. I'm just using American money so people can follow it. And then the Nazis would send $4,500 worth of German goods, let's say tractors or whatever, to Palestine. The World Zionist Organization would sell the goods there, and then when the Jew arrived in Palestine, they would give him the money that they got from selling the goods. So what you had was, on the one hand, Jews going to Palestine got a discount over every other Jew going out the door with money, and on the other hand, the Zionists were breaking the anti-Nazi boycott.
Okay, so I want to get into that. So here there's this worldwide boycott of German goods. Hitler is really shaky, and then the Zionists come in and say, we'll sell German goods to help our project in Palestine.
Right. Okay, and then they did more than that. At that time, the Zionists were a minority, let's say 20% of the population of Palestine. Palestine was run by the British, and the British established an annual quota of how many Jewish immigrants could come into Palestine. But if you were bringing over $5,000 worth of money into the country, you could come into the country over the quota. So all of a sudden, in the middle of the Depression, when everybody in the world is dead broke, okay, all of a sudden, Palestine, and the Zionists particularly in Palestine, starts prospering because about 13,000 German Jews came in over the quota with $5,000, at least $5,000 each, worth of in wealth, okay. And so now it's very important to put this in a proper perspective. The Zionists weren't doing this to save Jewish lives, because nobody was talking about lives at that time. Hitler was not talking about them, and neither were the Zionists. What the Zionists were talking about was saving Jewish wealth. Okay.
Now I want to make the point that the facts in this are really not controversial. If you read some of the articles about this controversy, these crazy things, wild left-wing theories. But I want to show you a book here. It's called The Transfer Agreement. Now, it's all about this same period, the same time, this agreement that the Zionist organizations made. Now, this book was not written by Lenni Brenner. You can see it says Edwin Black. He describes this in actually more detail than Lenni Brenner, because Lenni was involved with a whole bunch of other things. He describes all these same facts, but with an opposite conclusion, where Mr. Brenner saw it as a betrayal. He saw it as something so good because, the German Jews were a lost cause, and you might as well get money out of Germany for Palestine. And this book was, this man, Edwin Black, is a Zionist leader, and there's an afterword by the head of the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, Mr. Foxman. So am I giving a fair summary of the credibility of this book and these facts?
In other words, again, as you said before, the facts aren't in disagreement. It's the interpretation of the facts and the intention of what they were doing. Today the Zionists say, "Hey, the Zionists were trying to save what they could out of the Germany, etc." But that's not really true. For example, in that time period, 1933 to 1939, which is when the war broke out, only 22% of the Zionist immigrants into Palestine came from Germany. In other words, the Zionist attitude is, hey, we got guys all over the world. They want to come here. So, we want to get their support, so we can't just take Germans. But then in addition to that, it's very important to understand, when it came to Germans, they only wanted certain German Jews and not others. Number one, they didn't want old people, because they come there and die, and who needs that, Okay. Number two, they wanted Zionists and people who could speak a little Hebrew, or people who had some money, or people who had trade skills that would be useful to the Zionists in Germany. So if you were, let's say, a German kosher butcher in Berlin, they did, 60-year-old German kosher butcher in Berlin, they wouldn't even give you an instant of their time,
So it's more about building up Palestine than saving.
Exactly.
I want to jump to your book again, the newest version. Could you hold it up with the cover?
Okay. Now, this cover is a Nazi, on the cover, Zionism, the Age of Dictators, and there's this, the two faces of a medal. Let me go into that because this goes directly into the topic. The Zionists, the Nazis decided, okay, we'll work with the Zionists. So the Zionists convinced Baron von Mildenstein, who was the Nazi head of the SS's what they call Jewish department. In other words, the part of the SS that specialized in dealing with Jews. And
if I may, if we recall, SS were the worst of the worst. Later on, yes, were in charge of the extermination. All right, go back to now to 33.
Good. Okay. And a Zionist convinced von Mildenstein to write an article on the Zionists in Palestine. But von Mildenstein said, look, before I write the article, I want to go to Palestine and, observe what's going on there. So von Mildenstein, the SS man, was a guest of the World Zionist Organization in Palestine for 6 months. And then he came back and wrote 12 articles for Joseph Goebbels, who was the propaganda minister, for Der Angriff, which means the attack or the assault, about his trip to Palestine. And Goebbels, to commemorate the trip, produced a medal. And this, I have the medal here.
You got it a couple of years ago, I understand?
What happened was some guy, a guy who read my book, found it in one of these Nazi memorabilia stores, right? And the store didn't understand its importance, but since the guy had read my book, he recognized it immediately and grabbed it and gave it to me, etc.
If you could hold it up.
All right, let me hold it up. Okay, and what it says now. The main thing about it is that on one side there's a Star of David, that's the Zionist symbol, and then on the other side is a swastika. And it says in German, of course, I'll read it in German and then translate it. A Nazi fahrt nach Palästina. Okay. A Nazi goes to Palestine and writes about it in Der Angriff, okay, which is Goebbels' paper. So there's no doubt that it happened. I mean, here's the medal. And what von Mildenstein said, and this was, again, to show you that the Nazis were patronizing the Zionists. This wasn't just Jews out of here, kind of thing. He said, okay, I'm reading from my own book. His stay among the Zionists has shown the SS man, quote, now I'm quoting von Mildenstein, quote, the way to curing a centuries-long wound on the body of the world, the Jewish question. The soil has reformed him and his kind in a decade. This new Jew will be a new people. Okay? And then Reinhold Heinrich, who was the head of the SS security squad. Now, this is the fist, man. They punch you, hard. Heinrich wished the Jews a farewell, and again I'm quoting him, quote, The time cannot be far distant when Palestine will again be able to accept its sons who have been lost to it for over 1,000 years. Our good wishes with our official goodwill go with them.
Reinhard Heydrich, who was to become one of the chief architects of the Holocaust, here sending Jews his good wishes. It's enough to turn your stomach. What you've seen so far should be enough to convince you that it is not at all anti-Semitic to talk about the disgraceful Nazi-Zionist collaboration in the 30s.
So that was an interview with Lenni Brenner, who has a book entitled Zionism in the Age of Dictators, where he talks about the deal that the Zionists made with Adolf Hitler and the Nazis. It even had a coin forged that had the Star of David, but I don't consider it the Star of David. It's the Star of Rephaim, and it's not the Star of David, so it's not a godly star at all. But anyway, and it has that on one side, and it has a Nazi symbol and some other writing on the other side of the coin. So that's a real thing. But anyway, and they also talk about the book, The Transfer Agreement, which is what it was called, for the Zionists to get basically Israel from all of this. And that book was written by Edwin Black, which was a Zionist, from what I can see. But the reason I do all this is because I'm documenting this information because I believe YouTube is going to take it all down. In fact, I'm trying to get away from YouTube and not be a part of it or not try to contribute to YouTube anymore. Because YouTube just is another control mechanism that's trying to shut everyone down. So I'm trying to document this stuff so that it's out in the world in other places besides on YouTube. So do with this information what you will, but definitely research it, because this is important information. If they can erase your history, like all these Zionists seem to be trying to do, they already control America. And I mean, they straight up talk about how they control America, how the American people know it and everything. And if you just look up the media, the different medias, you could see all the different Jewish people who are running the media. The people who are trying to impeach Trump, look really closely, because most of them are Jews. Now, I'm not saying all Jews are bad, because I know some people will say I'm anti-Semitic because that word is just beaten in their head. But if you just look real closely, you might notice that there's something going on right under your nose that you haven't been paying attention to. And the people that are telling you this stuff, if you attack them and call them anti-Semitic every time they speak without actually hearing them out, because some people have reason behind what they're saying. You know, when Adolf Hitler was taking over when he was killing Jews, was it anti-German to warn that Adolf Hitler was killing Jews? I mean, should we have shut our mouths when he was killing the Jews? No, I don't think so. So why is it when the Jews are, or I shouldn't say all Jews, a certain segment of Jews, Zionist Jews, elitist Jews, are trying to push an agenda to try to basically gain power and rule the world, which is what every government tries to do? Why is it when that happens, you get called names, you get your name dragged through the mud, and you're suddenly this bully, you're suddenly racist, you're this horrible person? To learn who rules over you, simply find out who you are not allowed to criticize. Voltaire wrote that. And that's true. So if that's Zionism, then think about it. But that's pretty much all I have for this show. So thank you very much for listening, and God bless. If you like this show, please share it with your friends. Promote it as much as possible before the internet censors us and takes down all of our content. Also check out the Fringianity Podcast Facebook group and page. New shows will be posted there, as well as show images. So check that out too. That's all for this show, so thank you very much for listening, and God bless.